When you first think about communication, the first thing that may come to mind is verbal communication. And verbal communication is a very important aspect of communication when communicating with anybody, from your boss, coworkers, friends, or family. But even though that is a very important part of communication, something that is just as important, if not more important, is nonverbal communication. In my speech today, I will be covering the three main systems of nonverbal communication, the first of which is the visual communication system, the second of which is the invisible communication system, and the third is the auditory communication system. The first system, the visual communication system, its primary component is kinesics. Kinesics is the study of how we move with our body, including gestures, eye contact, and facial expressions, along with posture. One great example of this would be people bowing. In countries like Japan, bowing is a sign of respect, and instead of shaking someone's hand when you go up to them, as you would here when greeting them, you would bow. And also, this is very different depending on what culture you're looking at, because, like I said, this is dependent on you being in Japan or some country that has this kind of gesture in place, rather than here in the United States, where if you were to do that, it may be a little bit weird. Instead, you would probably go for a handshake or a hug if you're close to them. Another great thing to think about when looking at the visual communication system in terms of your understanding of how you're communicating and how you're communicating with others is to look at whether something's communicative or informative. If it's communicative, it means that it's intentionally being broadcasted. Like if I would say like thumbs up, like I'm looking at somebody saying that's a great thing, you did a great job. That's something that like you're intentionally broadcasting to other people in terms of communicating with them. But then there's also informative actions, which are things that people do almost subconsciously or not intentionally doing. Like if I were to cross my arms because I was nervous, or like stare at the ground or stutter, something like that. It's not something intentional that the person is doing, but it's something that still can display a lot of what's going on with them in terms of their emotional state and how they're feeling. Another important aspect of the visual communication system is proxemics. This has to do with how close you're standing to someone. For instance, in a relationship with someone very close, like a significant other, family member, cousin, something like that, you'd probably be standing closer to them because you're more comfortable and they're more comfortable with you. Whereas if you were at work with someone you don't know very well, or just someone you've met out on the town one night out at the bar, you're not going to be standing as close to them because both you and them probably wouldn't be as comfortable. So it's a great way to make sure you know how to stay within your boundaries, knowing like what situation you're in and how close you should be standing. The second system I'll be covering is the invisible communication system. The main components of this are haptics and olfactics. Haptics are sense of touch and physical touch in communication, while olfactics are scent-based. A good example of scent-based communication would be scent. And if you smell bad, someone may be less likely to approach you.
Oh, you smell gross.
Whereas if you maybe change something and smell good.
You smell pretty good. We should talk more.
Thank you. And this is especially apparent in the United States, where people don't communicate with scent or smell as often as in other places, but we particularly pay attention to stronger smells. This is also a good way when communicating with different genders to take this into account, because females are normally more perceptive to these kinds of things and use scent more often than males do. Haptics also are a great way to tell what stage of a relationship people are in, because when people are closer, they're more likely to physically touch each other, whereas if it's a less close relationship, like with a coworker or a boss, people are probably not going to be touching people on the shoulder or hugging people or kissing people. The third system of communication I'll be covering is the auditory communication system. The main component of this is paralinguistics, which has to do with rate, volume, pitch, and emphasis. These are all great ways to tell someone's emotional state when talking to them, because these slight inflections on people's voices tell a lot about how they're feeling. If someone's quiet, stuttering, or talking in a stern tone, it can give off a lot about what they're trying to communicate to you. And also, reading those signs is a great way to then figure out how you should communicate with them, because if they seem like they're quiet and nervous based on their tone or rate or volume, you could try to go at that situation in a way that better suits that other person. Another important part of this communication system is strong emotions such as laughing, yawning, crying. These are all things that are included in the auditory communication system that you can process. They can tell you a lot about somebody, because obviously if they're laughing or crying, you can get the gist they're either happy or sad. So it's something to take into account when looking at this style of communication. In conclusion, the visual, invisible, and auditory communication systems are all very important in a mastery of communication, not just verbal communication. This is extremely apparent when looking at the statistic from the textbook, in which 65 to 90% of all communication is delivered through or enforced by nonverbal communication. And even at the low end, being 65% of all communication, it still makes up a majority of this chart when compared to verbal communication. So if you're looking to master this kind of communication in general, nonverbal is a great way to start doing this. Or if you've already mastered verbal communication or think you have, it's a great way to make sure you bring together everything by mastering these cues and nonverbal signals. And these are just my